What are you doing here? Billionaire finds black waitress crying at his son's grave. What happens next will shock you. What if the person you'd been blaming for your son's death turned out to be the very person who tried to save his life? Margaret Williams knelt beside the marble headstone, her weathered hands trembling as she placed a single white rose against the cold stone. The September rain had soaked through her thin waitress uniform, but she didn't seem to notice. For 3 months, she'd come here every Tuesday after her shift at Ruby's Diner, always alone, always carrying the same flower. The inscription read, "Michael Harrison, beloved son, age 22. Margaret's tears mixed with the raindrops as she whispered words only she and Michael could hear. She didn't notice the black sedan that pulled up behind her, or the footsteps approaching through the wet grass. When the deep voice cut through the silence, "What are you doing here?" Margaret's heart nearly stopped. She turned to see the man whose life she'd shattered, whose grief had become her own unbearable burden. "Where are you watching from today?" Richard Harrison stood 6 feet away from the woman he'd spent months trying to forget. At 68, the steel industry mogul had built an empire through decisive action and unwavering control, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of his son's face in the twisted wreckage of that Honda Civic. The police report was clear. Margaret Williams, 43, single mother of 2, had run the red light on 5th Street at 11:47 p.m. on June 15. His son Michael, driving home from his job at the community center, never had a chance. Margaret slowly rose from her knees, clutching the headstone for support. She was smaller than Richard remembered from the courthouse, her dark skin drawn with exhaustion, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "Mr. Harrison," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rain. I didn't know you came here." "Every day," Richard said, his voice harder than he intended. "Unlike some people, I don't need to schedule my grief." The words hit their mark, and he saw Margaret flinch. Part of him felt satisfied, part of him felt ashamed. Michael would have hated hearing his father speak that way. Margaret wiped her face with the back of her hand. "I know you don't want me here. I know I don't have the right." She took a shaky breath. "But I need to tell him I'm sorry. Every week. It's the only thing that keeps me going." Richard studied her face, searching for the callous drunk driver he'd imagined all these months. Instead, he saw a woman drowning in the same ocean of loss that had swallowed him whole. Her uniform name tag read, Maggie, and he noticed the small gold cross hanging from her neck, worn thin from years of worry. "Sorry doesn't bring him back," Richard said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. Something about her presence here, her obvious pain, didn't match the story he'd told himself. In all his visits to Michael's grave, he'd never once seen flowers except the ones he brought himself. Yet here was this woman, this stranger who'd destroyed his world, leaving roses like she truly cared. Margaret nodded, fresh tears streaming down her cheeks. "No sir, it doesn't. Nothing ever will." She turned to leave, then stopped. "But maybe you should know the truth about that night." Richard's chest tightened. "I know the truth. The police report." "The police report doesn't tell you about the little girl." Margaret's voice was steady now, strengthened by a resolve Richard hadn't expected. "It doesn't tell you about Keisha Thompson, age 7, who ran into that intersection chasing her ball while her mama was trying to get groceries out of her car." The rain continued to fall around them, creating a curtain of privacy in the empty cemetery. Richard felt the ground shift beneath his feet, not from the wet earth, but from something far more unsettling. "What are you talking about?" Margaret sat down on the stone bench near Michael's grave, her hands folded in her lap like she was in church. "I was coming home from my second job that night, cleaning offices downtown. I saw that little girl dart into the street just as your son was coming through the intersection. He had the green light, Mr. Harrison. He was driving perfectly legal." She paused, gathering strength. "But he saw her too." Richard's throat felt like sandpaper. "That's not," the report said. "Your son swerved to miss that baby. Drove his car straight into mine to save her life." Margaret looked up at Richard, her eyes clear despite her tears. "The impact threw me forward, knocked me unconscious. When I woke up in the hospital 3 days later, they told me I'd been drinking. Said I ran the red light. Said it was my fault. The words hit Richard like physical blows. He stumbled backward, his mind racing to process this revelation. But the blood test, you were over the limit. I work 2 jobs to feed my kids, Mr. Harrison. I don't drink. Never have. Margaret's voice grew stronger. But I had a concussion, and they took my blood 12 hours after the accident. 12 hours after they gave me pain medication that made me sick, made me confused. The lawyer they gave me was fresh out of school. Told me to plead no contest, said it would be easier. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. Richard felt his legs give way, and he sank onto the bench beside her. Everything he'd believed, every ounce of his anger, every sleepless night spent hating this woman, it was all built on a lie. But if this was true, then Michael had died a hero, not a victim. And Margaret Williams wasn't his son's killer, she was the woman whose life his son had died trying to protect. Why didn't you fight it? Richard's voice cracked with emotion he'd kept buried for months. Why didn't you tell them what really happened? Margaret let out a bitter laugh that held no humor. Fight it with what, Mr. Harrison? I'm a single black mother working 2 minimum wage jobs. My lawyer spent 15 minutes with me before court. The police officer who wrote the report never even interviewed me, just saw the blood test and closed the case. She wiped away fresh tears. I tried to tell everyone about the little girl, but nobody wanted to listen. They said I was making excuses. Richard felt the walls of his carefully constructed grief crumbling around him. For 3 months, he'd channeled his unbearable loss into anger at this woman. It had given his pain a target, a reason, a way to avoid the more devastating truth, that sometimes terrible things just happen, even to good people like his Michael. There's more, Margaret whispered. Your son, in those few seconds before the crash, he looked right at me. And he smiled. She pressed her hand to her heart. Not scared, not angry. He smiled like he was telling me it was okay, that he knew what he was doing. That saving that little girl was worth it. The image of his son's final moments, not as a victim but as a hero, broke something inside Richard that had been frozen since June. The tears came suddenly, years of suppressed emotion pouring out like a dam bursting. Margaret, without thinking, reached over and took his hand. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I'm sorry you lost him. I'm sorry I survived when he didn't. I'm sorry you had to carry all that anger when you should have been able to grieve in peace. They sat together in the rain, 2 broken people sharing the weight of an impossible loss. Richard thought about the Michael he'd raised, the boy who'd volunteered at soup kitchens, who'd worked with underprivileged kids, who'd chosen social work over the family business because he wanted to help people. Of course he would have saved that child. Of course he would have smiled in his final moment, knowing he'd done the right thing. The little girl, Richard finally managed. Keisha, is she? She's fine. 8 years old now. Still asks her mama about the angel who saved her life. Margaret squeezed his hand gently. I visit her sometimes. Tell her about your son. Have you ever faced something like this? Let us know in the comments. Richard felt something shift in his chest, not healing, not yet, but the first crack in the wall around his heart. Maybe, just maybe, there was another way to honor his son's memory. I want to meet her, Richard said suddenly, the words surprising them both. Keisha. I want to meet the little girl my son died saving. Margaret studied his face carefully. Mr. Harrison, are you sure? Her family, they don't have much money. They might be intimidated. I don't want to intimidate anyone. Richard stood up, pacing in the small space between headstones. I want to understand. For 3 months, I've been living with this rage, this need for someone to blame. But if Michael died saving a child... He stopped, turning back to Margaret. Then he died exactly the way he would have wanted to. Doesn't he deserve to be remembered for that, instead of as a victim? Margaret rose slowly, hope flickering in her eyes for the first time since the accident. There's something else you should know. Keisha's mama, Sharon, she's been struggling since the accident. Feels guilty that her baby caused all this. She works 3 jobs now, trying to afford counseling for Keisha. The little girl has nightmares, keeps asking why the nice man had to die because of her. Richard's heart clenched. Another family destroyed by that night, another person carrying undeserved guilt. Where do they live? East Side. Apartment complex on Maple Street. But Mr. Harrison, Sharon's proud. She won't take charity. This isn't charity. Richard's voice grew stronger as the idea took shape. My son worked with kids like Keisha at the community center. He believed every child deserved a chance to succeed, regardless of their circumstances. What if we started something in his name? Not just for Keisha, but for all kids who need help. Margaret's eyes widened. A foundation. The Michael Harrison Foundation for Children. Scholarships, counseling, after-school programs. Everything Michael cared about. Richard felt a spark of purpose he hadn't experienced since his son's death. And I want you to help me run it. Me. Margaret stepped backward, shaking her head. Mr. Harrison, I can't. I'm nobody special. I'm just a waitress. You're the woman who's been visiting my son's grave every week for 3 months. You're the woman who knew his final moments were about saving a life, not losing one. You're the woman who's been carrying this truth alone because nobody would listen. Richard's voice grew firm with conviction. Michael chose to save Keisha. Now I'm choosing to honor that choice. Will you help me? If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. Margaret looked at the headstone, as if seeking Michael's permission. Then she looked back at Richard, and for the first time in months, she smiled. Yes. I'll help you save as many children as we can. 6 months later, Margaret Williams walked through the bright, welcoming doors of the Michael Harrison Community Center, her arms full of enrollment forms from families across the city. The transformation from bitter enemy to trusted partner hadn't happened overnight. There had been difficult conversations, tears, and moments when the grief threatened to overwhelm them both. But slowly, working side by side to build something beautiful from their shared tragedy, Richard and Margaret had found healing in purpose. The center buzzed with activity. Children who might otherwise have been on the streets after school were getting homework help, learning computer skills, and participating in art therapy sessions. Keisha Thompson, now 9 years old and thriving, had become the center's unofficial mascot. She no longer had nightmares about the accident. Instead, she told everyone about her guardian angel Michael, who made it possible for kids like her to have a safe place to learn and grow. Richard emerged from his office, where he'd been reviewing scholarship applications. At 69, he looked younger somehow, his face softened by the knowledge that his son's final act had sparked something meaningful. How many today? He asked Margaret, nodding toward the forms. 43 new kids this week. And Sharon finished her nursing degree, starts at General Hospital next month. Margaret's own transformation was remarkable. The broken woman Richard had found at the cemetery had become a confident advocate for children, her natural compassion now backed by purpose and respect. They walked together to Michael's memorial wall, where his photograph was surrounded by drawings and letters from the children he'd never met but continued to help. Margaret placed a fresh white rose beneath his picture, as she did every Tuesday. But now Richard stood beside her, no longer in anger but in partnership. Think he'd be proud? Margaret asked softly. I think he'd be amazed that 2 stubborn people like us figured out how to work together, Richard replied with a gentle smile. But mostly, I think he'd be happy that Keisha and all these other kids have a chance. As they stood there in comfortable silence, Margaret reflected on how completely their lives had changed. She'd lost her job at Ruby's Diner when Richard offered her a full-time position running the center's family outreach program. Her own children, Marcus and Diane, now had college scholarships waiting for them. Most importantly, she'd found forgiveness, not just from Richard, but for herself. The Michael Harrison Foundation had grown beyond their wildest dreams, but the real miracle was simpler. Two people who had every reason to hate each other had chosen love instead. They'd chosen to honor a young man's sacrifice by making sure it counted for something beautiful. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Thank you for joining us on this journey of forgiveness, hope, and the power of turning tragedy into triumph.